All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, Raymond, you ready to do this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Raymond Rodriguez. Raymond, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Guy.
You are very welcome. So Raymond is a clinical social worker with over 20 years of experience in clinical practice. He received his social work degree from Columbia University School of Social Work, where he now teaches as part of their adjunct faculty. His clinical interests include family therapy, trauma-informed care, immigration, anti-oppression, and LGBTQ empowerment. In the last 10 years, Raymond has specialized in trauma therapy, assisting clients with complex psychological trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. He's certified in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, as well as in sensorimotor psychotherapy, and has extensive training and practice in psychodynamic psychotherapy. Raymond is currently on faculty with the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute. Raymond, welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be here, Guy. Thank you.
You're welcome. So before we get going here, as I ask all my guests, where are you from originally and where are you now currently?
Absolutely. So I am originally from Puerto Rico. I was born and raised in the Caribbean island, and I moved here as an adult to go to college, actually. And one thing led to the other, and I'm still here. I currently reside in New York, in Westchester, and practice in New York City.
Awesome. All right, Raymond. Well, I cut to the chase. How the heck did you get into this field? Let's do it.
Yes. So for me, it was a bit of a winding road that brought me into counseling and eventually into trauma therapy. I went to social work school, believe it or not, to study policy, and I actually did that for some time postgraduate. And it was a passion for me. It has always been working with people. But during my graduate studies, I discovered counseling and really fell in love with it. As you probably know, social workers have to do what is called field placement. We're working with people in direct practice. And so I started working with people, and I just loved it. Loved the counseling, the intimacy, being able to help people get to places that they have been wanting to, but haven't been able to. And so I started as a family therapist. That was sort of my first sort of home. And for about a decade, I did that, and I still do, and hold kind of a systemic lens in everything I do. And then in the last decade or so, I became sort of more involved in the trauma field, and that's primarily what I do now.
When you said when you initially got into social work, it was to study policy.
Yes, social work policy, yeah.
So what is that?
Mm-hmm. Right. So social workers, as you know, work in different settings. Like you have school social workers, but you also have social workers like in government agencies and nonprofit. And so I had originally envisioned a career in what is called social work policy, or working with government in things like child welfare or homelessness services or youth services. That's sort of what my original aim was.
Right.
And again, I did that for some time, but always maintaining a clinical private practice on the side, and eventually decided that I wanted to do that full time.
When you were younger, when you were in school and thinking about going to college, what was the idea? What was the pull for you?
Yes. So, that's also a fascinating story. I remember when I was in high school, a very dear professor, teacher of mine in high school said, "Raymond, you need to work with people because you're very good with people." And at that time, I didn't quite know what he meant. I just kind of took it in. And then went to college and actually studied environmental policy, sort of always an interest in policy. But as I sort of worked in different settings, I really began to understand what that teacher said to me very early on, that you need to work with people. And that's what kept pulling me back into working in settings where I was doing more direct practice and eventually into counseling.
Well, I can see what that teacher saw. And I mean, you have an incredible, seriously, Raymond, you have an incredible presence about you that is so like warm and allowing. It's really incredible. So
thank you. I have heard that before.
Yeah, well, it's no joke. I mean, it's funny because I remember when I was in I went back to fulfill my undergrad to go to graduate school. I wanted to become a physician, and I was going through the pre-med stuff, and it just was not my strong suit. I was not doing well at all. And someone said to me, "Guy, you know what? I'm going to say something to you, and I don't know how you're going to handle this, but I don't think you should be doing this. I think you should be working with people." I thought the guy was on crack. I was like, but anyway, look, so when you started learning about trauma, what happened for you? What were you thinking? And so
absolutely. Yeah. So that's another interesting story. As I said earlier, I was a family therapist, and I really loved that work, meeting families, working with children, working with couples, and I really felt that I was quite successful at it, doing what it seemed to me like very good practice, and the feedback from clients was that they were really feeling better or feeling helped, etc. But I always felt that something was missing, that there were certain things that people were bringing up that I didn't quite know how to work with, how to address. And I'm particularly reminded of this one a female individual client that I work with who experienced a lot of anxiety and panic attacks. And I remember feeling ill-equipped in really working with her. Like I was using more talk therapy and all the maps that I had learned in graduate school and in family therapy didn't feel sufficient to me. And in fact, I vividly remember in my office her having a panic attack once, and I was trying to engage with her and help her through dialogue, through talking, and that wasn't really doing much. And so from there, I remember attending a workshop with Janina Fisher, who's become a mentor of mine. Many of your listeners may know of Janina's work. And she said something that really stuck out with me. She said, that trauma people oftentimes don't have memories, they have symptoms. And I began to see, oh my God, all my people are having symptoms. And if you think of panic attacks, it's a symptom of something that's happening deeper. And so that was sort of my first introduction to the trauma field. And slowly but surely, I began to read more, attend more workshops, and realize, God, there's something important here to be learned, where talk therapy is limited. It doesn't address sort of deeper issues that may be had, and that we have these new modalities that are better able to address those deeper experiences, trauma that people may not have readily access to through cognitive memory, because as we know, trauma is stored more in implicit memory. And so that's what really pulled me into the trauma field. And the more that I learned, the more that I had a language, the more that I learned different maps in addressing complex trauma and bringing that into my office, I really saw people excel in ways that I had not been able to experience before. And so eventually I kind of fully transitioned into that kind of work.
When you first learned about that, when you met Gina, were you still in school or were you out of school and practicing?
Yeah, I was practicing then, fully practicing in a community mental health setting. Seeing a number of clients with different presentations, and I also had a private practice on the side as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I had a bit of liberty in what kinds of modalities I wanted to use. And at that point, I was using more the maps of family therapy and psychodynamic psychotherapy.
Well, when you started learning about trauma and even studying trauma, was that something that you moved towards easily, or was it something that you were like, oh my God, this is very intense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a little bit of both. That's
Yeah.
another great question, Guy, because um, is it, I find it the understanding of trauma to be somewhat different than what is traditionally taught in graduate school or also in other modalities. So it took me a while to really make sense of these different maps and to integrate them more fully. But one thing that I was able to do relatively easily was integrate specific pieces, like, for instance, the understanding of the body. I learned that very early on in my trauma training and began to look at people's bodies in ways that I had not seen before. Like, you know, the way that I had been trained was kind of looking at facial expressions and really addressing feelings and cognition. And suddenly I began to learn, oh my God, there's a body in front of me that I had not paid attention to. And that's when I began to look at implicit memory, on how the body is holding that implicit memory. So for instance, you know, clients that are depressed, oftentimes their bodies present as being more collapsed, or their heads are hanging, or their shoulders are drooping, or they're looking down. And that is a very specific presentation that we now understand as hypoarousal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or when the person is in an anxious state, right? The tempo of their voice, their prosody is faster. Oftentimes they're looking up, right? And they feel more elevated, right? So we understand that now as hyperaroused states, right? So I began to make sense of some of the things that I was seeing in my clients' bodies, and making sense of that and integrating very specific skills that anyone can learn to address some of those presentations. And I began to see changes. And that's truly what sort of began to help me get more involved in the trauma field. Yeah.
And at what point did you, currently you're on staff with Sensorimotor SPI, Sensorimotor Psychotherapy. At what point did you start studying sensorimotor work?
Right. So that was also a little over a decade ago. And because I love Janina's work, she was one of the first persons that I learned trauma therapy from, and Janina Fisher is also on the faculty of the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute. And sort of in getting to know her a little bit more at different workshops, and because she speaks often of sensorimotor psychotherapy, I said, you know what, that's something that I want to study. And that's what truly kind of made me take that leap and began studies in sensorimotor. And then that led to my being invited to be part of their faculty after completion of their certification process.
That's awesome. That's exciting. Yeah. So let me ask you something. I don't usually do this, but I want to put you on the spot here. Absolutely. Can you perhaps share a little more detail into how you worked with a particular client before you studied or SPI work, and maybe how you worked with a particular client afterwards?
Absolutely. So
what that might look like.
Sure, certainly. So when I was more practicing from a family therapy modality, I was looking more at things like, let's say, genograms, right? I would sit with a family and understand family dynamics, family relationships, multi-generational issues and how they were showing up, parenting concerns. And so then my therapy was geared towards helping people engage in different ways of relating with one another, with a certain amount of behavioral interventions as well, and helping people make sense and gain insight into the kinds of things that they were doing that were problematic or fostering conflict within relationships. So that was kind of a primary map that I had. So I would employ and deploy a lot of talk therapy around that, sort of more insight oriented in, those aha moments, in making connections in how, my parents related to me, and how I'm sort of reenacting that with my children or with my spouse, let's say, right? And then attempting strategies to shift that. And so that's sort of a broad stroke in how I practice. However, the way that I practice now is much different. And so what I'm looking for now is, how do those conflicts exist within perhaps a larger context of something that happened to you? Right. So whatever conflict that you're having, let's say, with your spouse or with our coworker or with a conflict, is it embedded within a larger narrative of trauma, of something that happened in your life, perhaps not something that I can consciously remember, but that the body remembers? And so, for instance, if someone, like I can recall, a client that I am working with right now, who's having a tremendous amount of conflict. This is a male identified client in a heterosexual marriage, and he's having a lot of conflict with his wife. And I meet with him individually. And so one of the places that we've landed is that the ways that he's relating with his wife are very similar to the ways that he related to his mother. He had a very overpowering mother, a very authoritarian mother, where he felt that he needed to shrink, to be small, to deny certain aspects of himself. And by the way, none of this came out of sort of a cognitive understanding of it, but it came out through the trauma processing. We just began to identify this conflict with his wife, and from a sensorimotor psychotherapy standpoint and a trauma informed, we began to look at how his body, what happens to his body at the moments that he's having conflict with his wife. And what we noticed is that he was going into a hyperaroused state, into a collapsed state. And we began to work with that collapsed state. And we discovered that it was a form of reenactment of something that he had experienced from very early on in his life, in his relationship with his mother. And in processing that, he's been able to have a very different relationship with his wife in the present.
Wow, interesting thing. I appreciate you sharing that. And perhaps not a place that either of you could have arrived at using a genogram or whatever, which isn't to dismiss those
absolutely
techniques at all, right?
And I have to say that I also continue to utilize those maps, and very often engage in doing genograms with clients, etc. So I don't want to dismiss that or speak negatively of those maps, but rather that they felt to me limited, that what the sort of trauma therapy or trauma-informed therapy and a deep understanding of neurobiology and implicit memory and the body has but enhanced the way that I conduct therapy now.
When you, as someone who is on staff with the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute, what do you notice about students who are just coming to the work, to trauma-informed education?
Yes. So oftentimes it's a complete reorientation, particularly students that have been trained in more talk therapy models. It is quite a bit of learning that they have to do. It's a bit of sort of switching gears and orienting into something completely different, say like the body, right? Like they've never had a language, or they even know how to conceptualize from a body-based psychotherapy. We often call it a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach. So it takes some time with what I describe as sort of newer therapists or people that are coming more recently out of graduate schools or the doctoral studies, right? It might be more easier to integrate because they haven't had the, what we now call procedural memory or around certain ways of working with people. So it may take some time. To be honest, sensorimotor can take quite a bit of practice for it to become more part of you, more embodied. But I do say that it's a phenomenal way of working, and I find it quite transformative for myself and also for clients.
Say more about that. What do you mean by that, transformative?
So I have a wonderful anecdote about that. Before endeavoring in studying sensorimotor psychotherapy, a supervisor of mine at the time, I am also certified in EMDR, and this was an EMDR supervisor that had also studied another somatic modality, somatic psychotherapy modality. And when I asked him, I am thinking of doing sensorimotor, what do you think? And he said to me, and I'll never forget, he said to me, Raymond, do it for you. Your life will change. And it took me back and I said, like, what, for me? What do you, I want to do this for my clients. And he said, no, you'll see, you will transform.
Wow.
And sure enough, that has been my experience, because something shifts when we're able to be more with our bodies, with ourselves, when we have a deeper understanding, a deeper awareness of our internal experience, what in sensorimotor we call the organization of our internal experience, and the parallel process that we are in when we're working with clients. And so that has been transformative for me in my personal relationships and in my personal life. And I often joke that I am a much happier therapist now than I was before. I often say that, if I am to summarize what my goal in therapy is with clients, is to help people expand their window of tolerance or their window of resiliency. And I hope that your listeners know what that means. And so as a sensorimotor psychotherapy therapist, I feel that my window has expanded, that I have a much greater capacity, not only for the kinds of things that clients bring me, but also for things that happen in my own life, that I have a greater capacity to navigate the difficulties. Like, for instance, Guy, as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of conflict happening all around us, just a few days ago, there was this huge massacre that happened in upstate New York that, has been really difficult for me as a person of color and working with a lot of people of color. And so I've used the skills that I also bring into my practice with clients in order to help myself, in order to help me come to a place of regulation so that I can be more effective in not only managing sort of what's happening all around us, but being more effective in engaging in actions that can lead to greater support for organizations, etc., that are addressing these larger conflicts.
If you would mind sharing specifically, what are you talking about when you talk about those skills and so forth?
Sure. So in sensorimotor psychotherapy, and I would say that in trauma therapy in general, most of us subscribe to a phase-oriented treatment, right? In which phase one is stabilization and what we call resourcing, and there's a number of skills that are incredibly supportive for clients and for us therapists as well around resourcing. So in sensorimotor psychotherapy, we also utilize phase-oriented treatment, and we engage the body in resourcing, right? So these are things, for example, when I feel dysregulated, right, I can bring my feet on the ground and press the ground very gently and begin to feel a sense of groundedness and connect to the ground beneath me through my feet. Or we can use the spine, and I can lengthen the spine and roll my shoulders back. And something shifts when we do that. Yeah, or feel the chair or the couch underneath me and allow my body to sink in and take in the support from this couch or this chair underneath me. Or another favorite of mine is what we call orienting technique, and all animals do this, right? When we go to a new place, we orient, which means that we look around, because when we're oriented to our surroundings, right, we often experience a settling, right? That can be resourcing if we use it deliberately. So I find myself these days orienting a lot, taking a moment, let's say in between sessions or at the end of the day or at the beginning of my day, and mindfully looking around me and connecting, contacting things that bring me joy, that bring me pleasure, and really allowing my body to take that in and to settle into those resources. So all those, and I said, and I went very fast through them, but all those are very important resourcing techniques from a body-centered approach.
Awesome. I appreciate you saying that. As we kind of wind down here, I want to ask you something. When we first started talking, you shared that initially you got into social work to study policy, but then you kind of moved into working with people. When you started working with people, can you describe the arc of your intention when you first started to where it is now? Did you start working with people for a specific reason? And has that shifted? Has that morphed? What does that look like?
Sure, a great question. So I think, and I see this in my students at the graduate school level, that most of us come into this field with a bit of a cavalier sort of sense that I'm going to change the world, right? And I'm really going to help people, right? And there's an implicit sense that I'm going to do something, that I'm going to change something, right? That I'm going to impact somebody. And though I still hold some of that, but I hold it much more lightly now. I trust now in the wisdom of the body, that there is inherent in all of us. And by the way, you see this in all trauma processing modalities. They have this in common. You see it in EMDR, in IFS, in AEDP, in sensorimotor, somatic experiencing. Those are my favorite modalities. That we believe strongly that there's something inherent in every human being, that if we just connect with it, change will naturally happen. So it's less of my doing, and certainly skills are important. Like, I don't want to dismiss that, but it's more about allowing. It's about trusting the process. It's more about mindfully being in the presence of whatever is coming up and removing whatever obstacle it is. It's there for that wisdom to flourish. There is an orientation, I strongly believe, in all of us towards health, towards well-being. And so I see my role now as creating the conditions that will allow a person's self, with a capital S, using sort of IFS language, to just emerge and thrive. So it's less of a doing and more of an allowing.
I talked about this incredible presence you have early
Oh,
on.
thank you.
Was that something that was just always there? I mean, obviously that teacher saw it, but did you walk into this work owning that? Did you have to cultivate that or allow that to come through? What was that process like for you?
I think a little bit of both. One thing that I don't know if it was in my bio, but it's also that I am an interfaith minister, and spirituality has always been very important to me. I grew up in a very religious family, and though I don't consider myself religious at the moment, I still hold a very strong spiritual foundation. And so that piece has always been there. And one of the pieces that I also find very valuable in all trauma therapy modalities is that they're inherently spiritual. And so when you ask, if this way of being has always been here, I think some element of it has always been there, but certainly learning more about trauma therapy and the body has but enhanced that. It has an enhanced an ability, a quality of presence, I call it. One of the mottos that I live by and that I hold very dear to my heart is a quote by Maya Angelou. You know, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that's a quote that I learned very early on. I think, you know, in college, and it really resonated with me. And it's one that I keep very dear to me. And I aim to also, you know, sort of bring that forward. I also want to say that I come from very humble beginnings. You know, I come from a very working class family that struggled a lot financially, and so I have a particular appreciation for people in general, and so I aim throughout my life, personal and professional, to connect with people in ways that they haven't always felt. Like, for instance, I go to the supermarket and I always make a point of looking at the cashier or the retail person in the eye and greeting them as if I greeted, you know, sort of the president or the organization, right? Like it's just but an orientation that I have that draws from my spirituality and that has been more enhanced in my learning of trauma therapy.
Wow. Well, as you were quoting that Maya Angelou quote, you've made me feel incredible. I mean, you are one really incredible person. Your presence just resonates, and I'm so excited for listeners to hear this. Raymond, how can people get in contact with you? Because I know people are going to want to reach out to you.
Oh, well, thank you. So my website is the easiest way, and there's a way there that people can email me.
Okay.
My website is raymondrodriguez.com, RaymondRodriguez.com. And that's also my email, raymondrodriguez@me.com.
Okay. And I'll have both of those listed up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Raymond, I've got to have you back at a later date.
Thank you.
Just loved talking to you, and you're incredible. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, it's been a pleasure being with you, Guy, and thank you for your service as well and bringing this to the community. I appreciate being here, and welcome coming back. Yeah.
All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Take good care of yourself.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.